Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
It's difficult to go to cocktail parties these days without getting one sip in and a question about weight loss drugs, GLP-1. What is GLP-1? People say it without knowing it, as you said, GIP and so forth. And what an honor that is to have such a interesting invention that can augment so many people's lives. So, we've been working in this space for a very long time. Yeah. That's probably not well recognized. We licensed our first GLP-1. We partnered it with a company called Amylin in 2003. We launched the drug in 2005. It was a twice-a-day injection, and it wasn't very good. Yeah. But it was the first GLP-1 drug. So I like to talk about this as sort of a 20-year overnight success. Most of the appreciation of that has come in the last 18 months, but kind of what we do well, and I think underappreciated part of our industry, is the time and energy it takes to create so-called breakthroughs. In some ways, the industry showed a lot of prowess during COVID, and we're very proud of that. But viral pathogens are really easy to conquer. Human disease that's more metabolic, or cancer, which is innate, or immunity, are much harder. And that sort of taught everyone that if we just put enough money and attention on something, we could fix it in a year, right? But that's not how most diseases work, and not how obesity works. But, through the years, we iterated and we found new things. Mostly that what was a drug designed for blood sugar control, that if we could give it at higher doses, you saw pretty profound weight changes. And then our scientists in the early part of the 2010s noticed that if we put two of these so-called incretin family proteins, so as you're eating your salad, your stomach is sending proteins to the other parts of your body to say, I'm being fed right now. One of those is GLP-1, which really affects glucose signaling. Another is GIP, which affects fat metabolism. Right. And by putting them together in a mouse in 2010, we demonstrated that you would lose even more weight, and it tolerized as well some of the nausea that people experience with GLP-1 alone. So we went about designing that into a drug, which we did in 2014. And in 2016, I remember a phone call I got from our current chief scientific officer. He was in a different role at the time, saying, you have to see this data. We tried this medicine in like a dozen people in Singapore who were otherwise healthy, most of which had to drop out of the study because they lost so much weight they needed to eat.
Oh my goodness.
So at that moment, I was like, okay, now we go as hard as we can.
And when you're trying to go as hard as you can, ultimately there is a sheer force of demand and limitations of supply. What does that look like right now? Because this is able to be consumed, to be used almost worldwide, but actually only a few markets you can actually get into at the moment.
Yeah, we've really only launched in 3 markets right now in a full form. We're working on expanding supply. In 2022, when we launched Mounjaro in the US, between Lilly and Novo combined, we probably made enough of this class of medicines for about 12 million people on the planet.
Just 12.
And 2 weeks ago, the WHO said there's 1 billion people with obesity. So we're a little short of the goal. We set about building new facilities. Novo has as well. They're buying companies, and we're partnering with other companies to expand. But interesting thing is, these are proteins, so they're a very specific kind of medicine that's complicated. And then we put it in an injectable system, which has to be, we can't purify, we can't assure that it's pure at the end of the process. We have to make sure the whole process is. So it's ultra clean room conditions, basically, to make it. And then we put it in a little injection device. That kind of system, probably in the whole world, 80% of the capacity is already controlled by Lilly and Novo. So there are not built sites to go buy or rent to make more. We have to make them ourselves. Yeah. So we're doing that. We currently have 6 manufacturing facilities under production or being stood up. We had 14 before, so that's like a 50% increase. We'll probably have a few more by the end of the year announced. I mean, we're going as hard as we can. But capital is not the constraint. Time is the constraint. Those buildings take 3 or 4 years from announcement to come online. So right now in the US, there's frustration because there's shortages of these, but we haven't even introduced them in most of Europe or the world. So more to do. one project we're working on could change that, which is an oral solid. So it's not a protein, it's chemistry, and it's not in that injectable device, which is so difficult to make. It's a pressed tablet. There's the world is awash in those capacities. And so should the drug be successful, I think we'll be able to tap into quite a bit more supply, which will be good for the US, but even better for places like Brazil or Mexico or China, where actually most of the obese people on the planet live and where the biggest health difference can be made.
And I know that actually Lilly, through its almost education campaigns and some of its advertising, really have been thinking very much so about equality within the consumption of these drugs. But before we go to that particular part, before we think more about R&D and a way in which these can be orally ingested, I mean, there has been ultimately a hype. And it's almost not of your doing. It's not to do with the pharmaceutical companies, the biotechs that are bringing this. This is actually a force of culture, a force of social media, a force of celebrity. And so much so that you recently put out a campaign ahead of the Oscars saying, you know, please don't take this if you don't need it. Yeah. Can you articulate some of the frustration of those stakeholders, maybe your employees, who want this to be in the right hands of the right people right now?
Yeah, so we launched this campaign, and we can come back to why we did that. But we really do want to make sure the medicines get to the people who need them most. And obesity, so one reason we launched it is destigmatizing a health problem. Yeah. So people think of obesity as a willpower problem, as an appearance problem, as a clothes fitting problem, or as a mobility problem, not necessarily as a health problem. But people who have obesity or overweight all their life have a shorter life. I mean, it is a life-shortening condition, and you have a shorter life because your cardiovascular risk is higher, diabetes, dementia, 200 human diseases that are derived from carrying excess body weight or obesity. So that's why we invented these. That's number one. Number two, we didn't study them in otherwise healthy people. Yeah. While we don't have a great scientific rationale for the cutoffs of what we call BMI, body mass index, we just sort of notice what's higher or lower, and we use the cutoffs established in medicine. It could later turn out to be true that what we think is, a healthy body weight isn't. But what we do know is people who are obese do have all these adverse health consequences. And that's why we study them in those populations, and why we're doing further studies on preventing those very things that obesity can cause.